There's an old proverb that says that you die twice, once when your body dies and once when anyone who remembers you dies.
It certainly is heartening to know that these people are not forgotten, like many of our ancestors and relatives. We keep them alive in our thoughts and in our hearts.
I remember the first time I saw this cemetery, it was probably about 10 years ago, and it's the oldest cemetery in Tampa. It goes back 150 years. There's lots of interesting stones here, and it's called Oaklawn. It's right in the heart of the city of Tampa, surrounded by churches and bus stations and prisons and all the things that cities have. So what makes it interesting? But while the city's moved on, is building condos, and it's just a bustling place, here we are in a place that hasn't seemed like it's changed in 150 years. It all looks the same. We've come down here a number of times just to wander around. It's a beautiful place anyway, and we like taking groups here and showing them this interesting cemetery and the stones. As you look around, you see the trees and you see the architecture. You point to the symbolism, the woodmen of the world, and the little lambs for the children's graves and so forth. It's hard not to find a story at every stone.
Yes.
But what makes it interesting is that they're famous people. There are people who are, like I say, governors and mayors and soldiers, but there's people who had just what we'd call ordinary lives.
Yeah.
And I think part of the charm is to stumble upon their stones and to figure out what were their lives like, what made their lives special, and that's why we're here, I think.
That's the fun part. Not only do the stones immortalize the people, but the records that still exist for their lives make a very interesting story, and it helps us to come into a cemetery, look at stones, and maybe have our interest piqued, and then go back and start pulling records.
Well, that's
to
right.
See what we can find.
The stones don't give us enough. They're just a starting point.
That's right.
And so you want to be able to flesh that out and see, well, the stone marks the end of the life, but what happened before? What happened from the birth, the marriage, their lives through the decades? And I think that once you put the whole picture together, you get that whole story, you can come back to that stone and go, now I understand how you got to where you are here. I understand what led to where you are.
And that's one of the things I enjoy personally about cemeteries is studying not only what's written on the stones, but the structure of the stones, the artwork on the stones, and really the stories that they have to tell. Just remember that some family member or someone had to make a selection of what would go on the stone. And the epitaphs are often very, very touching.
And I think that's the part that persists, the part that stays forever if it doesn't get worn off the stone, is you come up and you read whatever it was that someone thought was important enough to immortalize. And I think that's what you stumble on and go, wow, that's an amazing statement there.
The one stone that we chose here in this cemetery for this research happens to be something of a controversial stone. It dates back to the 1870s, and the two people who are buried beneath that stone are William Ashley and Nancy Ashley. And what makes the story controversial is that William Ashley was a slaveholder before the Civil War, and Nancy Ashley was his cook, his servant. And the stone itself mentions master and servant.
She was his slave.
She was his slave, and we were able to find that very quickly in the 1850 and 1860 population census and the slave schedules.
We looked at census records to document that they were there, that certainly William Ashley was there, and that Nancy appeared to be there for several decades, that she was there as a slave. She appears in the slave schedules early on. A woman of the right age is in the household.
And then the slave schedule of 1850, and then again in the slave schedule of 1860. And there were only two individuals in the household at that time. There was William Ashley and Nancy Ashley. And then in the 1870 census, it shows that William Ashley is there and Nancy Ashley is there by the same surname, and her occupation is listed as cook.
Right.
Now, certainly the traditions of the time, the laws at the time prohibited them from marrying. And so they had this relationship for at least 20 years, more than 20 years.
And as we looked through the records, we found, both looking at the wills, and we find no evidence of children. We assume that, as I said, they knew they could not legally marry.
And that would have been quite controversial in the 1870s.
Well, that would have been controversial in many southern cities for many decades, I think. The interracial issue certainly wasn't resolved anywhere close to that for many, many years. It would have caused some eyebrows to raise. And so that alone, the fact that this happened right at that critical time period in the South, and in the city still dealing with the results of the Civil War, and to see these two side by side and to wonder, well, what was behind this? What were their lives like, and what did they end up with? Not unusual that someone, a slave that's freed, might take the name of their former master. That's not so unusual.
That's right.
But the fact that they're buried side by side, and there's more to it, because the epitaph says there's something here. There's a relationship here that's special, and that was the thing that
transcended death.
The transcended death. This epitaph that was put there by their executor and tells what the relationship really was. It wasn't simply a master and a slave. It was beyond that.
Yeah.
William and Nancy Ashley, and the amazing social commentary that I've never seen anywhere else on a stone. Here lies William Ashley and Nancy Ashley, master and servant, faithful to each other in that relation in life. In death they are not separated. Stranger, consider and be wiser. In the grave all human distinction of race or caste mingle together in one common dust. And this is an amazing statement.
So far ahead of its time.
Yeah, 80 to 90 years before the Civil Rights Movement.
Yes.
And you've got their friend, John Jackson, who has erected this to commemorate their fidelity to each other. This stone was erected by their executor, John Jackson, 1873.
And remember, John and William were working together in the 1840s and 50s. William Ashley was a well-respected man in the community, along with the 9th mayor. And the 9th mayor was John Jackson. And between the two of them, they put together the first survey and laid out the street grid for Tampa. And the thing that's interesting is they named the streets for governors, for congressmen, for important people, and yet when it came to the bottom line, Jackson named a street for himself, and he named another street for Ashley.
And what's interesting, of course, is that Ashley and Jackson's streets intersect.
Yes.
So it makes me think about the fact that the intersection of these two men's lives, which led to government in the city of Tampa and eventually to this probably warm relationship between these two men all the way past Ashley's death, is sort of immortalized in that intersection of the two streets right there in downtown Tampa.
The other thing that's important about the grave site is that the lot was purchased at the time of William Ashley's death, and that his will provided for Nancy's freedom, for all of his earthly possessions to be passed on to her, and for her to be buried in that same lot.
More than almost 100 years before the modern civil rights movement, this is a statement of civil rights. It's astounding for it being so far ahead of its time. That's what strikes me about it. It's this kind of a statement you'd expect to see written in the 1950s or 1960s, not in the 1870s. And it's startling. I've never seen anything quite like it in any cemetery I've ever been in, that someone would make that kind of a social commentary. George, you realize what the stone is saying here? It says, stranger, consider and be wiser. We're the strangers here, and it's up to us to consider what has happened here. And I think that's what we've done by telling this story. By doing the research, we have become wiser, and we realize what this stone means.
It's a tremendous instruction to all of us.
Yeah. And we made a point of choosing this particular stone and telling this particular story to reach to all those strangers who couldn't come to this cemetery.
And I think the monument that's been left behind by John Jackson as their executor to the relationship between William and Nancy says a lot. Says a lot about them, says a lot about the community at the time, and it certainly tells us, reminds us, that there's very little difference between all of us.
I'm glad we picked this stone.
I am too. This is a favorite. Drew, I've had a wonderful time researching this story. I've learned so much and had such a good time. But there have got to be hundreds and hundreds of other tombstones across the country that people have seen, they've gotten ideas about, and they want to learn more.
That's true, George. And if you know of a tombstone that you would like to have investigated, why don't you email us? And be sure to watch Roots Television for more episodes of Down Under.